Hi, I'm Marci Kobayashi, and I'm back again with another excerpt from Finding Yoyu. If you've been following along, then you know that last week I was talking more about my career and how I was growing my business than about my in-laws. And you've probably guessed that that didn't last very long. So let me jump right in. Even though I was absorbed with my work, we did stay in contact with Akira's parents. He called his mother regularly, and we were tentatively planning to visit again in November to make sure she was okay. Our timing was a little off. Akira's mother called during the first week in October. She shared that she had been consistently losing weight and strength, so much so that when she saw the doctor the week before, he decided to give her an IV. Then, the doctor asked her to come back again the next day for another IV. Going back to the hospital again meant Okasan was driving her into town, and Okasan didn't like being a burden. To us, it was a concern because we had doubts as to whether Okasan should be driving at all. There was no bus, and a taxi would be too expensive. At least the route into town was a route Okasan had been driving for 60-plus years. Unfortunately, even after several days, Okasan still wasn't getting any better. Her doctor recommended that she stay at the hospital for a few days to fully recover. That was why she had called. Okasan wanted to know what Akira thought. Of course, he encouraged her. It seemed like the only answer, and we both thought that, given a few days or even a few weeks, Okasan would have more strength and ask to go home. It's hard to remember the details now. We have the hospital records, so I know that Okasan was admitted on October 7, 2014. We both had busy schedules ahead of us. Still, even after 2 weeks in the hospital, Okasan wasn't showing any improvement, so in late October, we rearranged our schedules and made the drive to Hiroshima again. I don't say that lightly because it is a grueling drive. It takes a minimum of 13 hours to get there. I remember thinking that this was just the beginning. We strategized in the car about how we could make this trip every other month and enlist the help of other family members so that someone was dropping in to check on Akira's parents every few weeks. We also talked more seriously about what it would look like if we took turns staying for extended periods. At that point, we fully believed it was just a matter of time before Okasan would be released. The truth is, we didn't realize how bad Okasan's condition already was before she went into the hospital. We knew that she hadn't been able to eat enough and wasn't interested in food. According to Akira's father, Okasan would take a bite of rice and work on it, chewing, rolling it around and never getting around to swallowing. He said their meal times took forever, and even then Okasan wouldn't eat all of her food. In the hospital, Okasan wouldn't eat more than a bite or two. She never fully regained her strength, and she never asked to go home. I have to remind myself of this because I think there is a degree of self-will and conscious choice. I believe that deep down inside, if Okasan really did want to go home, she would have found a way to express it to us. In the larger scheme of things, I think more than anything, Okasan simply wanted to retire from taking care of the home and Otosan. Being in the hospital was the only available way out for her. Okasan had her cell phone with her, so even at the hospital, we called to check in on her regularly. Oh, how I wonder if things could have been different if I had gone to stay with her then. What if I had been there to help nurse her back to health? I carry a smidgen of guilt and a ton of regret. If I knew then what I know now, I would pack my bags and head to Hiroshima immediately. I don't know if staying there again would have made a difference, but I regret not giving it a try, and now I'll never know. I couldn't grasp what was happening because I was fully absorbed with growing my business. In the strange, serendipitous way that life works, I firmly believed it was thanks to Okasan and having to work remotely from their home while she had surgery that the new projects and a new stream of income was presenting itself. Even after we visited in October, I wasn't that concerned about either of Akira's parents. We continued to call Okasan regularly and felt sure her hospital stay would help. I was still feeling smug that we already had Okasan in the system. She already had a care manager she trusted, and I was convinced we could get even more help once Okasan got her strength back and came home. Before heading back to Tokyo, we stocked up the cupboards for Otosan and promised Okasan we'd be back again in a few weeks to celebrate the holidays. November and December flew by. Akira taught his last class for the year, and we packed up the car. We were planning to spend the holidays in Hiroshima as usual, especially considering Okasan was still in the hospital. Instead of driving straight through, we decided to stay overnight at a hot springs resort. Everything about that detour was perfect. Years later, we still talk about the sushi we had at the mom-and-pop restaurant and how beautiful Mount Fuji was the following morning. Though we both wanted more than a one-day vacation, we were anxious to check on Okasan. The next morning, we were back on the road early and arrived at the house in Hiroshima in the late afternoon. From the outside, the house looked okay. There were already several feet of snow on the ground, and Akira's father had cleared the long drive from the main road to the back of the house. Inside, the house was dark except for the overhead light in the family room next to the kitchen. The toasty warm family room was the only room in the two-story house with a heater, and obviously where Otosan spent most of the time when he wasn't outside. The house was remarkably clean considering that the caregiver that came once a week to help with household chores wasn't coming anymore now that Okasan was in the hospital. Otosan had been waiting for us. We had picked up groceries before heading up to the house so I could make dinner as soon as we arrived. Otosan said it wasn't necessary because he had saved some cooked fish for us. He proudly pointed out the pot of rice to go with it. Though the fish looked questionable, we ate it anyway because it smelled fresh. Otosan had cooked it with his own blend of seasoning that I couldn't recognize. His fish was edible, even if a little odd-tasting. Otosan had been surviving well enough on his own, though he had clearly lost weight. It is not that he didn't have access to food. He was surviving on the cooked dishes he could buy at the grocery store and bread. Mostly bread. Otosan loved bread. Even with all the layers of winter clothes, he looked thinner and his face was gaunt. Knowing his love of bread, I was surprised that he had lost weight. He must have forgotten to eat. Though it was nothing that a few good meals wouldn't fix, Otosan's appearance scared me a little. I think it scared Akira too. We didn't talk about it much that night. We were exhausted from the drive, and all three of us went to bed early. The next morning, we made the trek into town to visit Okasan and talk with her doctor. I couldn't reconcile the weak woman I was seeing with the woman I had spent time with a few months earlier during the summer. Where did she go? We wanted some answers. Why was she still in the hospital, and what were they doing to help her? What was really wrong? Why wasn't she eating? Then we learned all about the testing that had already been done. The doctor could find no physical reason for why she stopped eating. Okasan had no problem swallowing. She simply refused to eat more than a bite. The doctor had begun treating her for mild depression. She also had a number of prescriptions for her rheumatoid arthritis and high blood pressure. Other than that, all they could do was look after Okasan and make sure she was comfortable. We were shell-shocked after talking with the doctor. Only one thing was clear. Okasan wasn't going to be leaving the hospital any day soon. The doctor reminded us that Okasan was reaching the 90-day limit. This was the real dilemma. The National Health Insurance Plan made it affordable for Okasan to be in the hospital and receive around-the-clock care. The only problem was that she was only allowed to stay for 90 days, and then she had to either go home or move to another facility. The nearest facility was a 40-minute drive from the house. It was too much in the winter weather for Otosan to make the trek into town to check on her. Okasan needed someone to advocate for her and tried to get to the bottom of her illness. Clearly, we needed to start returning to Hiroshima regularly, or one of us needed to stay. The only other option was to transfer Okasan to a hospital near her home in Tokyo. We made it through the rest of the day and came back home to eat dinner with Otosan. Like the day before, we all went to bed early. It was December and freezing cold upstairs, but I had the electric blankets on high, so it was warm when we snuggled into the futons to sleep. We plugged in our phones and lay there quietly for a few minutes, and then looked at each other. At that moment, I knew that he knew that I knew. The situation was so clear that we could no longer ignore it. We could no longer not be a part of their daily lives. I felt sick inside because we had perhaps waited too long. I had been there over the summer to help take care of the house and keep an eye on Otosan while Okasan had surgery. Why, oh why, had I thought she would be okay on her own after being released and returning home? It wasn't like we had abandoned her. She did have several weeks of rehabilitation before she came home. Still, why did we assume she would be better than ever before? Why did we leave her to fend for herself? Akira and I talked briefly and decided the only choice was to bring Okasan to Tokyo. Considering how cold it was in the winter and how much weight Otosan had lost in the last month, we knew we had to bring him too. I heard Akira's breathing slow as he settled into a deep sleep. We had just made a life-altering decision. I felt the certainty. I also felt the void of not knowing how it was supposed to look going forward. It was a familiar feeling. It had been 16 years since my father died. The trajectory of my life changed when I chose to be with him and participate in his transition. I remember the moment I made the choice. I was sitting in the waiting room at the hospital while my father was recovering from surgery. I was journaling at a little desk facing the back wall, and my aunts were sitting on the sofas behind me. My body felt tight and restless. I had been at my job for only a year and was loving it. I had made a quick trip home to be there in time for Dad's surgery. Now I was trying to decide whether to request an extended leave of absence or quit. Dad had a brain tumor and was not expected to live long, even after the surgery to remove it. The doctor had said we could expect him to survive anywhere from 3 to 6 months or maybe even a year if we were really lucky. Sitting there at the little desk, I made a list of the pros and cons and was trying to weigh my options. It was gut-wrenching. How could I give up this full-time job? How could I not? It was my first job out of college and a dream job. I put my pen down because I knew the decision to leave my full-time job in Japan had already been made. Waking up to the decision brought a little bit of relief because it was one thing I had control over. Deciding to move back to the U.S. for an indefinite period so that I could be part of my father's transition marked a definite end of one chapter and the beginning of a new chapter. Ironically, Dad died a short 2 weeks after I arrived home to be with him. I thought about asking for my job back, but knew inside that that particular life path had already been severed. I couldn't have gone back right away anyway. It took several months to go through Dad's things and figure out what to do with his house. Eventually, I returned to Japan to be with Akira. Akira had been my supervisor, and if I had stayed in that dream job or even returned to it, it would have been difficult for us to continue our relationship. Later, I realized that leaving the job and the country gave me the space to consciously decide to return to Japan so that we could give our relationship a try. I always felt like Dad paved the way for me to be with Akira. Years later, laying there in the dark in Hiroshima, I thought about how different my life might have been had I not left Japan to be there for Dad. How different it might have been had I not returned to Japan to be with Akira. I knew that moving Akira's parents to Tokyo was another one of those forks in the road that would totally change the trajectory of my life. Okay, that's all for today. And, every week when I make these videos, afterwards, my mother always asks, so are we finally going to be in Tokyo next week? And you would think that next week we would be, but sorry, Mom, there's just one more little bit that I need to share next week before we actually make it to Tokyo. So I hope you all hang in there with me, and eventually I'll be living with, Otosa will be living with us here in Tokyo, and Okasan too, because her story goes on for quite a while. Thanks everyone, and I'll be back again next week. Bye for now.